Well, people are having fewer kids. It's a persistent problem, or problem depending on who you talk to, that threatens the global economy. As the cost of living and childcare continue to rise, can countries do more to support parents? A new report out from HSBC global economist James Pomeroy dives deeper into the data, and he's joining me now. And James, first of all, people like Elon Musk have said that this lower birth rate is going to cause the collapse of civilization. I guess, first of all, explain to us, why is it a problem that people are having fewer kids?
Well, exactly. I think a lot of people will say, isn't it fantastic that the world's population either isn't growing as quickly or starts shrinking? And that will do quite a lot to help us with some of the challenges we have, making sure we have enough homes, tackling some of the environmental issues that we face as a planet. So some people would say this is a good thing, but it's a damaging thing in terms of economic sort of momentum and economic growth. If you think about working age populations and how crucial they are in terms of determining the number of consumers, the number of taxpayers, the number of workers, it's absolutely fundamental. And what's happening with birth rates at the moment in most economies is they're falling really, really quickly to levels that most people thought wasn't possible. And so what you're ending up getting is a situation where in some economies, we're talking about populations that could halve during the course of the next generation based on the path they're on because of how low birth rates are. So it's a potentially big challenge for potential GDP growth, for the size of the labour force, and for many other economic variables beyond that.
Well, we're all going to be replaced by robots anyway, so it's okay. No, just kidding, James. So I guess if you're going to attack the problem, first of all, you have to figure out why it's happening, right? Do we have good insight into why the birth rates are going down?
There's a number of different reasons. I don't think many economists or demographers have really said it's exactly this reason or exactly that reason. There's a number of things we think are really, really contributing to it. Firstly, there's some big social changes. So we've had many more people getting married later, starting families later because of changes in sort of the things they're focusing on as couples or as families. You've had a greater participation of women in the workforce, which has played a big role in pushing the age of first-time mums back in many economies, and that continues to play out across the world. There's the huge economic question as well. The cost of buying a home, renting a home large enough to raise a family, thinking about the cost of childcare. In many economies, they're hugely prohibitive for many young people who therefore just cannot afford to think about raising a family. And therefore, it becomes almost impossible for many young people. That's clearly playing a bit of a role, one that's accelerated after the pandemic. And then there's big questions about social attitudes. Now, a lot of young people today are worried about climate change. They're worried about the impact they could have on the world by bringing more people into it, or the world they could be raising their families into. So these sorts of social dilemmas too are playing a role. But there's many, many reasons why these birth rates are coming down. And there's a huge challenge for governments to think about how they can try and lift them back up again.
Well, let's get to that question then, right? I mean, we've seen certainly policy work in the opposite direction in the case of China, most notably trying to limit the birth rate at one time. So how do they convince people to, attacking climate change, maybe, if that's one of the reasons?
This is the challenge, is it's very easy, well, theoretically much easier to make people have fewer children than it is to encourage them to have more children, because therefore you're sort of forcing a lifestyle change on people. So you can almost encourage people to have larger families, or you can make it easier for them to do so. And of all of the variables that are out there, it's very hard for policy to impact people's social changes and the way the economy is evolving. The bit that's easiest to tackle is some of the financial issues here. So if you look at the cost of raising families, you look at childcare support, you look at how expensive certain parts of education are, or very young childcare. These sorts of things, lowering the cost of those or improving the quality of those can really make a difference. Thinking about making it easier for young people to get on the housing market. If you look at a lot of developed economies, if you look at essentially the cost of housing versus median wages, it's just really not possible. So what we think you're going to see more and more so in the coming years is governments have to think quite seriously about this to try and take away some of the financial constraints that families are facing in terms of starting a family. And if you can do that, then maybe these birth rates, they won't necessarily surge. If you look at places like Sweden or Norway, where you've got very, very generous childcare policies, birth rates are still below the replacement rate. Populations are still shrinking. They're just not quite collapsing at the speed as they could elsewhere. So trying to get those birth rates up would be a good start. And governments will need to do it, because otherwise you're going to have many fewer workers, just as you're going to have a rapidly aging population. And that imbalance is one that creates a whole load of fiscal problems for governments 20 years down the line.
Yeah, we were just looking at, as you were outlining, the different ways that policymakers have addressed this, and we were just showing some of them as well.
Yeah.
I mean, just paying people to have kids, like as you said in Japan, although Japan obviously still has a big sort of geriatric problem as well. Has that been more, has any of these approaches been more effective than others? Like, I would think just giving people money sometimes is the most intuitive, right?
It can work, right? The question is how much you give people. And what we're seeing actually in terms of the amounts that have been handed out by governments across the world, you've seen these sorts of policies in places like Singapore for a long time. Poland has tried similar policies in recent years as well. They can work. They can really make a difference in terms of taking away some of the challenges for parents. But in many cases, they're not enough. You're still encouraging people to take on a cost which is extremely high, and need to sort of stretch their earnings even further than they need to, even with the support the governments are giving. So you've seen places like Korea and Japan is going to go down a similar path of just multiplying the payments they're giving out to try and sort of turn these things around, because a lot of these governments are now getting the data in from 2022. They're saying how few children are born, and they're almost panicking. They're looking at these numbers and going, well, hang on, if we do the maths, if you're Korea, you look at your current birth rate, if nothing changes, your population is dropping by 60% this century. So you've got to take serious action. So I wouldn't be surprised if we were to see even more generous financial support for young people thinking about starting families to try and turn this around, because it's something that's getting quite embedded in the data. The pandemic probably hasn't helped, and that number is more likely to move lower than higher in the years to come unless something dramatic changes.
I'd like to get paid for my children. Thank you so much, James. James Pomeroy, global economist at HSBC. Really interesting stuff. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.